What about astrology? What do we mean by astrology today? Does the church permit the use of astrology? And then what did Aquinas mean by it?
So, in the history of science, originally we didn't even have the concept of science. What we now call natural science was called natural philosophy. And it was all just one big field. So, like you have Aristotle, in the 300s BC, writing about natural philosophy, and he's covering basically every field of modern science in one way or another. Over the course of time, as we learned more about different disciplines, as the amount of knowledge accumulated, we got specialties in different fields. But it took a while for them to be distinguished from each other. So originally, there was no distinction between astronomy and astrology, just like there was no distinction between chemistry and alchemy. Chemistry and alchemy used to be the same thing. Astronomy and astrology used to be the same thing. And it was obvious to ancient people that the sun and the moon and the stars have influence here on Earth. I mean, the sun makes it light, it gives us warmth, the moon affects the tides. You can use them to measure, okay, when is the right time to plant your crops? When is the right time to harvest your crops? The question was just how much influence do they have? And in the past, it was assumed they've got a lot. And this was the case in Aquinas's day. In Aquinas's day, astrology, which was the same thing as astronomy, was considered a respectable science. And you had all kinds of people. I mean, this was the norm in educated society, was to use astrology for various purposes. And you have saints like Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus. I mean, he wrote a whole book on astronomy/astrology. So this was not the modern understanding of astrology where we view it as, oh, that's this superstitious thing. The stars don't really have that influence. And they don't, but they didn't know that at the time because it was obvious that there is influence on Earth from things like the sun and the moon, and they thought the same thing was true of the stars. In fact, they thought that the stars had, from our perspective, really strange forms of influence. For example, one of the things that and this is a great example of something that Aquinas would consider a cult that was still totally fine: magnets. Magnets have the ability to attract iron because of this invisible hidden force they've got, and that people back then didn't know how to explain. Now today we can explain it with quantum mechanics, but back then they didn't know how to explain it. And so Aquinas would say a magnet is an example of something that has an occult force that is beyond the knowledge that man can assign its cause to.
Right.
So magnets were occult. Well,
makes sense.
The reason, according to Aquinas, the reason anything has the abilities it does is because of its substantial form, to use a term from his metaphysics. The substantial form of a thing determines what it is and what abilities it has. And so if something has the substantial form of a magnet, it has the ability to attract iron. Well, he thought that God communicated things substantial forms to them by the power of the stars. So he would say the reason a magnet can attract iron is because its substantial form comes from the stars. And so it's the influence of the stars working through the magnet that lets it attract iron. And so he would, this is an example of just how much influence he thought the stars had. And this was normal in the science of his day. Now, today we don't buy that, but that's what people at the time thought. So they took astrology very seriously. And it was not the stupid, jokey, hokey astrology that you find in a newspaper today. They were very serious about it. They wrote these books, very extensive and learned books of how they thought, astrology would affect things and how you could make accurate predictions. And Aquinas knew that when astrologers talk about something, they're sometimes right and they're sometimes wrong. And with some of the things they're right about, they can be always right about. Like if they predict an eclipse, this is an example he gives. When astrologers predict eclipses, they can do that with certainty. But then there's a class of things, he would say, that they can't predict with certainty, but can for the most part. And this would include things like storms or famines or things like that. And then there's a class of things they really can't predict. And the things they can't predict with at least with reliability are free will decisions. Because humans have been given free will by God, and so we can make our own choices. But even though we have freedom, Aquinas would say, that doesn't mean the stars don't influence us. So just like the stars influence magnets to give them their abilities, the stars, Aquinas said, can influence our human nature by, for example, making a given man passionate or angry or something like that. So they could affect our feelings. Then we have the free will choice of, do we go with our feelings or do we resist them? And so he would say that since most men just go with their feelings and don't choose to do the nobler, harder thing, astrologers could predict that, oh boy, there's going to be a bunch of people in this country who are going to be really mad and they're likely to go to war. And so astrologers could predict things like wars in a probabilistic way. They can't say for sure it's going to happen, but they could say the stars are going to make a lot of people angry, and that's going to make a war very likely, even if we can't say for sure that it's going to happen, because the king may, by his free will, say, sorry, no, that's a stupid idea. We're not going to war.
Interesting. Okay, well, along these lines, where did the idea come from that when there's a full moon, people act kind of more erratically or something to that effect?
That is something that goes back. Now, I don't know of a passage where Aquinas discusses this, but it's something that goes back into classical history, and it was connected. Now, I think one of the reasons for this legend is because people are more active during a full moon because of the extra light.
That makes sense, yeah.
If you're going to go out at night and do stuff, like maybe burgle somebody, it's easier to do that with a full moon than a new moon.
Interesting.
So I think that just the physical light the moon gives is partly responsible for why certain things tend to happen in a full moon. But the ancients believed that the moon had this influence over all kinds of phenomena that it really doesn't. One of them was epilepsy. Epilepsy in the ancient world was sometimes attributed to the moon, and if someone was having an epileptic seizure, they were said to be moonstruck. That's where moonstruck comes from. And so it's like the moon would cause a person or an animal to have an epileptic seizure. And so that's one of the ways the moon was thought to manifest and have an effect on Earth and potentially cause bad things to happen in a full moon.
Okay, well, thanks.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.